In the frozen December sky of 1943, the thunder of war rolled across Europe like an endless storm, and high above the clouds, a young American pilot named Charles Brown guided his battered B-17 bomber through the smoke and fire of enemy territory. It was his very first combat mission, a flight that was supposed to prove his courage, but would instead test his soul. The mission had gone wrong from the start. Flak had torn through the engines, cannon fire had shredded the tail, and half of his crew lay wounded or dead inside the trembling fuselage. The oxygen lines were cut, frost bit at their faces, and the once mighty flying fortress now staggered through the sky like a dying bird. Brown's hands shook on the controls, his breath short and frozen in the thin air as he tried to keep the crippled machine alive. His compass spun uselessly, his radio was gone, and every light on his dashboard flickered like a dying heartbeat. Below him stretched the dark fields of Germany, enemy ground waiting to claim him, and above him the endless cold of heaven that felt 1,000,000 miles away. Every second he thought of his crew, boys barely older than him, bleeding, praying, whispering the names of their mothers. There was no chance left, no guns, no hope. Then, through the haze of oil smoke and the endless echo of the engines, came a shape, a German Messerschmitt fighter, its nose painted yellow, sliding out of the clouds like a phantom of death. Brown saw it and knew his time had come. The bomber was defenseless, and the enemy had every reason to finish what fate had begun. But the German pilot, Franz Stigler, did not fire. Through the cracked glass of his cockpit, Brown saw him, calm, steady, with eyes that did not burn with hate, but with something deeper. Franz had already downed many enemy planes that year. One more kill would earn him the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest honor. Yet as he drifted closer, he saw the blood on the windows, the holes in the wings, and the young men clinging to life inside that wrecked bomber. He remembered the words of his old commander who once told him, "You follow the rules of war, but never forget the rules of humanity." And so, instead of pulling the trigger, Franz made a choice that defied everything the war demanded. He flew beside the dying American plane, wing to wing, signaling with his hands, guiding them toward safety. Brown could hardly believe what he was seeing. His enemy, his would-be killer, was now his guardian. Together, they flew across miles of German sky, two enemies bound by a silent pact of honor. Anti-aircraft guns on the ground tracked the pair, confused, but Franz never left the bomber's side until they reached the North Sea, the invisible line that marked the edge of Germany. "There," he saluted, his eyes lingering on the broken fortress one last time, and then turned away into the clouds. Brown's bomber limped home, barely touching down on a British airfield. His crew staggered out, alive, saved by the mercy of a man they had been taught to hate. When Brown told his superiors what happened, they didn't believe him. How could an enemy show mercy in a war that had swallowed millions? But Brown knew the truth, and it lived with him for the rest of his life. The war ended, years turned into decades, and Brown returned home to America. He built a life, raised a family, wore his medals with quiet dignity, but the face of that German pilot never left his memory. In the long nights when sleep wouldn't come, he would stare at the stars and wonder if Franz had survived the ruins of Germany, if he remembered the bomber he let go. For 40 years, that question haunted him. Then one day in the early 1990s, Brown wrote his story in a veteran's newsletter, hoping the man might somehow read it. And miles away in Canada, an old pilot named Franz Stigler opened that newsletter and froze. He knew that story. It was his. Tears filled his eyes as he realized the man he had spared had lived, had remembered, and had searched for him. Letters crossed the ocean, and soon the two men met face to face. When they finally stood before each other, the weight of 40 years melted away. There were no uniforms, no flags, only two old men whose hearts still carried the echo of that December sky. They embraced like brothers, and the cameras that captured the moment showed not soldiers, but souls bound by a single act of grace. From that day on, they became inseparable. They visited each other's families, shared stories, holidays, laughter, and the quiet understanding that only men who have faced death together can know. When one spoke, the other listened with the patience of kin. Reporters asked them what it meant, and Brown said, "Franz didn't just save my life. He saved my faith in humanity." In time, their story spread across the world. printed in books, told in documentaries, taught in schools as proof that compassion can survive even in the darkest places. When Franz Stigler died in 2008, his obituary did not call him an ace or a hero of Germany. It called him the man who showed mercy. And when Charles Brown passed away soon after, their families buried them not far apart, as they had wished, bound forever by the bond that had begun in the sky. Their friendship became legend, a testament that war can divide men, but it cannot destroy the human heart. Somewhere above the clouds where they once flew, the sound of engines fades into silence, and two pilots, once enemies, forever brothers, fly side by side into the endless peace they both earned. Years rolled on like dust carried by the wind, and though peace had returned to the world, Charles Brown could never quite silence the roar of engines in his heart. He had come home to an America eager to forget the war, a land of new beginnings, new machines, and new dreams. But somewhere deep inside, the young pilot who once looked into the eyes of mercy at 21 could never let go of that moment. Time turned his hair gray and his metals dull, but memory does not age, it only grows heavier. He worked as a commercial pilot for years, guiding passenger planes across calm skies that once had been battlefields. Every time he looked down from 30,000 feet, he thought about that German fighter, the yellow-nosed Messerschmitt that appeared out of the winter mist and chose compassion instead of conquest. Sometimes, after flights, he'd sit alone in quiet airports, sipping coffee, staring through glass at the clouds, wondering if Franz Stigler still lived somewhere under that same sky. But war has a way of scattering souls. Brown wrote to archives, to air museums, to military offices, anyone who might hold a record of the man who spared him. But the years after war were full of silence. Files were burned, names forgotten, memories buried beneath rubble and politics. Still, Brown refused to give up. He kept the old story alive at veteran gatherings, telling younger men what he had seen. Many smiled politely, thinking perhaps it was the dream of an old soldier. But to Brown, that German pilot wasn't a myth. He was real as the scar on his heart that never healed. In Germany, Franz Stigler lived a different kind of silence. He had survived the war, but it had left him hollow. The cities he once defended lay in ashes, and the proud Luftwaffe he had served had become a memory stained by madness and loss. When Germany fell, Franz walked away from the ruins, carrying with him the ghosts of his comrades and the weight of a war that had taken everything but his conscience. He never spoke much of his victories, never glorified his kills, because in his heart, he knew the only flight that truly mattered was the one he didn't finish, the day he spared an enemy instead of ending him. In post-war Germany, there was no celebration for men like him, no honor for choosing mercy over obedience. He lived quietly, working as a mechanic, then later emigrating to Canada in search of peace. He built a small life there, far from the noise of history, but the memory of that broken bomber never left him. Sometimes he would sit in his workshop, the smell of oil and steel all around, and close his eyes. He could still see that flying fortress limping through the clouds, still see the terrified young pilot inside, still feel the pull of his trigger finger that he had refused to obey. The world saw him as a soldier, but inside he was something else. A man who had fought a war with his own soul and found victory in restraint. 40 years passed. The world changed, borders moved, enemies became allies, and the skies that once rained fire now carried only the hum of jetliners and the quiet dreams of travelers. Yet across all that time, two men, one in America, one in Canada, carried the same story like a sacred secret. In the early 1990s, fate decided to bring it to life again. Brown, now retired and living quietly in Florida, decided to write his memory for a small veteran publication. He wrote not for fame, but for closure, a desperate letter to the past. He described the mission, the damage, the German plane that had spared them. He ended the story with a wish. If that pilot still lives, I'd like to shake his hand. The article was printed, read by thousands of old airmen, and then, like a spark finding dry grass, it reached Canada. One morning, Franz Stigler opened his mailbox, pulled out the newsletter, and froze. There, in black and white, was his own story told from the other side. His hands trembled as he read, tears falling onto the paper. For decades, he had wondered if the American crew had made it home alive. Now he knew they had, because of him. Without hesitation, he wrote a letter back to Brown, introducing himself not as an enemy, but as the man who had escorted him through hell. When Brown received that letter, he sat silently for a long time, staring at the handwriting, the words, the name. After 40 years of wondering, searching, and dreaming, he finally held proof in his hands. The man who had saved him was real. The two began writing, exchanging letters that carried laughter, memories, and the long-awaited peace of understanding. In 1990, they agreed to meet in person in Seattle. The day of that meeting was bright, calm, the kind of sky that both men had prayed for so many times in war. When they finally saw each other, there were no words, only tears, and an embrace that felt like coming home. Two men who had once been enemies under orders now stood side by side as brothers under God. They spent hours talking, not about politics, not about victory or defeat, but about life, choices, and what it meant to be human when the world had gone insane. Their friendship grew stronger with each passing year. They traveled together, spoke at air shows, shared their story with schools and veterans, teaching the next generation that honor is not defined by the flag you serve, but by the heart that beats behind it. In the years that followed their reunion, Charles Brown and Franz Stigler became living proof that compassion could outlast war. Their story, once whispered through the wind between two broken planes, began to spread across oceans and generations. Together, they attended reunions, air shows, and history gatherings, standing not as a victor and a vanquished, but as brothers bonded by a moment that defied history. When people saw them together, it was as if time itself bowed in respect. Old soldiers wept, young cadets listened in silence, and even those who had never known war felt the weight of their story settle in their hearts. Reporters came from everywhere to capture their friendship, newspapers, documentaries, magazines, all asking the same question. How could two men raised to destroy each other become family? But Brown and Stigler never gave speeches filled with politics or anger. Instead, they spoke softly, humbly, always returning to that single moment above Germany when hatred gave way to humanity. Brown would say, "Franz showed me mercy when he didn't have to. He showed me that even in war, there are men who listen to their hearts." And Franz, with a quiet smile, would reply, "I could not have shot. I would not have lived with myself if I had." Their bond reminded the world that courage is not always about fighting harder. Sometimes it is about choosing not to fight at all. The two men began to spend every possible moment together. They called each other every week, spent holidays as one family, and even flew together in restored World War II aircraft for commemorative flights. To see them sitting side by side in the cockpit, the German and the American, once enemies in the skies, was to witness a living miracle. They laughed like boys again, trading stories of the old days, teasing each other about their flying styles. At air shows, crowds would gather around them not for autographs, but for the warmth they carried. They spoke of forgiveness, of brotherhood, of the strange grace that had brought them together. When asked how it felt to be reunited after 40 years, Brown once said, "It felt like closing a circle I'd been walking all my life." Franz nodded, adding, "It's as if that day in 1943 never ended. It just paused until now." Their wives, too, became close friends, sharing meals, laughter, and the quiet pride of knowing their husbands had rewritten history, not with bullets but with compassion. Letters poured in from around the world, from veterans who had lost faith in humanity, from families who had lost loved ones, from young people who had never known war but found hope in their story. Some called it divine intervention, others called it fate, but both men simply called it mercy. As the years moved on, their friendship deepened into something almost sacred. When one fell ill, the other traveled miles to be by his side. When they spoke on the phone, it was never about the past battles or medals, but about life, gardens, grandchildren, the beauty of quiet mornings. They had become old men by then, yet when they were together, they carried the same spark that had once burned in the cockpits of their youth. In 2003, when a documentary crew filmed their story, the world saw something rare. Two men whose handshake carried more power than any treaty, whose friendship had done what politics never could: heal the wounds of war. Their story was featured in books and classrooms. Even military academies studied their bond as an example of moral courage. In Germany, Franz was finally recognized not as a soldier who disobeyed, but as a man who had honored the true spirit of humanity. In America, Brown was celebrated not just for surviving, but for forgiving. They became symbols of reconciliation, living reminders that peace begins not with governments, but with individuals brave enough to see their enemies as humans. But even heroes grow old. As their hair turned white and their steps slowed, they both knew their time together was drawing to a close. Yet they never feared death, because they had already stared it in the face and found friendship staring back. When Franz grew sick in 2008, Brown wrote him every week, reminding him of their flight, of the sky they once shared. Franz, weak but smiling, would tell friends, "Charlie is my brother. We met in heaven's shadow, and that's where we'll meet again." When Franz passed away that March, the world mourned quietly. Newspapers around the globe told his story, but what mattered most was that Brown lost not an enemy, but a brother. Less than a year later, as if the bond between them could not be broken even by death, Charles Brown followed him. Their families honored their wish to be remembered together, two pilots, one from each side of a terrible war, united forever by mercy. Today, their names are engraved side by side in the archives of aviation history and in the hearts of all who hear their story. High above the clouds where they once met, the sky carries no flags, no borders, no hatred, only the silent wings of forgiveness. Their story is a song of humanity whispered across time, reminding us that in every battle, there is always room for grace, and that sometimes the greatest victories are not won by the strongest, but by the kindest. Long after the engines had gone silent and the battlefields had turned green again, the story of Charles Brown and Franz Stigler lived on like a warm flame against the chill of history. Teachers began to tell their tale to classrooms full of children who had never known what war sounded like, and every time the words were spoken, you could feel the room fall still. It was not a tale of victory or defeat. It was a tale of choice. The choice one man made when faced with the power to kill and the courage instead to spare. Museums hung their photographs side by side, the weary young American in his flight jacket and the sharp-eyed German ace in his leather cap, both frozen in a moment when the sky demanded mercy. Veterans stood before those pictures and cried softly, remembering their own lost enemies, their own moments when humanity might have whispered louder than orders. Brown and Stigler had become something larger than men, larger than soldiers. They had become a kind of quiet scripture, written not in words but in action. Their story crossed borders faster than any plane ever could, translated, retold, and passed from mouth to mouth until it reached people who no longer remembered the war at all. In a world still wrestling with new hatreds, it stood as proof that mercy never ages. Film crews retraced their flight path across Europe, following the ghost line of that December morning. Historians combed the archives and found the flight logs that confirmed every detail. Pilots young and old visited the same skies in modern jets and said they felt something holy in the air. Somewhere above the clouds, it was as if those two souls were still there, flying wing to wing, keeping watch. At airfields and military bases around the world, their names began to appear on plaques and memorial stones. The U.S. Air Force recognized them both as examples of what it called the higher duty of honor. The German Luftwaffe honored Franz Stigler posthumously, declaring that his act of mercy had upheld the truest spirit of the aviator's code. Together, their legacy became a bridge across generations of pilots who swore never to forget that day. Young cadets studying at flight academies read about the moment when a Messerschmitt escorted a bomber to safety, and instructors would pause to let the silence speak for itself. Some said the heavens must have guided Franz's hand that day. Others said it was simply one man's refusal to let war steal his soul. Whatever people believed, the lesson was the same. Humanity is not a weakness. It is the only strength that survives. Even governments that once stood on opposite sides of the conflict use their story in peace ceremonies, reminding the world that reconciliation begins not with treaties, but with empathy. The BBC, CNN, and History Channel produced documentaries that showed footage of Brown and Stigler sitting together, laughing like brothers. In one clip, Brown leans toward Franz and says, "You know, you could have ended my life." Franz smiles and answers, "No, Charlie. If I had done that, it would have ended mine." That exchange, simple as it was, became the heartbeat of every retelling, a single sentence that carried the weight of an entire century. As time pushed forward and the noise of modern life grew louder, their story kept circling back, like an old song played on a quiet evening. Writers compared them to ancient warriors who discovered honor in restraint, to shepherds who laid down their weapons at dusk. The book A Higher Call was written to preserve their memory, and it climbed bestseller lists across the world. Readers found themselves crying over pages that described a sky filled with fire and yet lit by mercy. Schools added the story to ethics courses, pastors quoted it in sermons, and soldiers carried it in their hearts when deployed to new wars that seemed to have forgotten the lessons of the old ones. Families who had lost sons wrote to Brown's and Stigler's descendants, saying that the story helped them believe that goodness still existed even among uniforms. In that way, the two pilots continued to save lives long after they were gone, not with bullets or bombs, but with the quiet power of example. And in every retelling, someone would say that the truest miracle was not that they met again, but that they recognized themselves in each other. For when Franz Stigler looked into the shattered bomber that day, he did not see an enemy. He saw a man who loved life as much as he did. When Charles Brown looked back 40 years later, he did not see a German. He saw a soul who had given him another sunrise. That recognition, that simple act of seeing, became their gift to the world. Today, when travelers fly over northern Europe and look down at the patchwork of fields below, few know that somewhere in that cold December air, history changed course. The radar screens are quiet, the contrails peaceful, but the sky remembers. It remembers two aircraft limping side by side, one shielding the other, a silent covenant of mercy written across the clouds. Historians may argue about battles and borders, about who won or lost, but the story of Brown and Stigler doesn't belong to any country. It belongs to everyone who still believes in decency. It whispers that honor isn't found in medals or victories, but in choices made when no one is watching. It tells us that even when nations burn and the world divides, one act of kindness can echo through generations like the steady hum of an engine that never quite dies. And so, in the great ledger of history, their story stands as a small, shining entry under the word hope. Charles Brown and Franz Stigler left behind more than a memory. They left a map for the human heart, showing that the way home is found not by following orders, but by following conscience. Somewhere, perhaps beyond the stars, two pilots fly again, side by side, their wings catching the light of an eternal sunrise. Guardians of the truth that mercy, once given, never fades.